Why did the room go quiet the moment she stepped inside? Not the respectful kind of quiet, the brittle kind. The kind that comes when people decide without saying it out loud that someone doesn't belong. Senior Chief Ava Sloan felt it before she saw it. 38 men, 2 women, boots scraping concrete, eyes lifting just long enough to measure her and dismiss her. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't smile. She simply laid the binder on the table and said the only thing that mattered. You meet the standard or you go home. That was it. No speeches. No warnings. The silence afterward stretched just a little too long, and somewhere in the back, someone laughed. Ava didn't react. She logged the sound the way she logged everything else, calmly, precisely, and walked away knowing this assignment wasn't about readiness metrics at all. It was about something rot deep and unspoken. By the third day, the resistance stopped pretending to be subtle. Gear was late, movements were sloppy, corrections were met with eye rolls and murmured jokes, not open defiance that would have been easy to shut down but a coordinated erosion designed to make her doubt herself. Ava had felt that pressure before in different uniforms, different countries, different stakes. She knew the pattern. When people can't outperform you, they try to diminish you. When they can't control you, they try to provoke you. She refused to give them either. She corrected errors without emotion. She failed unsafe drills without apology. She documented everything. And that, more than any raised voice, made them angry, because she wasn't playing their game. She was letting them expose themselves. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. The gym cage behind the barracks lit up after dark, half the lights burned out, shadows stretching long across steel bars and chalk-scarred concrete. Ava trained there every night alone, not to prove anything, to stay sharp, to stay honest, pull-ups, grip work, slow, controlled movements that spoke of discipline earned the hard way. She felt eyes on her sometimes, but she never looked back. Men like that didn't attack when they were unsure. They attacked when they thought no one was watching. When they thought the story could be twisted later. Ava knew the blind spots in the camera coverage. She'd seen the floor plans on day one. She also filed nothing about it. Silence can be a kind of bait if you know exactly what you're doing. The mistake they made wasn't underestimating her strength. It was underestimating her patience. Why did she take her time getting dressed when she heard boots outside her door? Because panic would have given them power. She counted instead. 1 near the door, 2 off to the side, 1 blocking the corridor. The knock came hard, mocking. Familiar voices now stripped of the safety of daylight and witnesses. Ava stood in the center of the room, calm, barefoot on cold tile, and said only one thing: leave. They laughed. They stepped inside anyway. A phone camera came up. Someone reached for her arm like it was already decided how this would end. That was the moment the room changed. Not with rage, with precision. Ava moved the way she'd moved 100 times before in training halls and cramped corridors, her body remembering what her mind never forgot. Control first, balance second, space reclaimed inch by inch. One man folded without understanding how. Another lost his footing and the air with it. The phone kept recording. That was important. Ava made sure of it. She didn't chase. She didn't strike out of anger. She restrained. She ordered. She documented. And when the last of them realized, truly realized, that this hadn't gone the way they imagined, it was already too late to rewrite the story. Because the truth had a timestamp. Security arrived to chaos and shouting, to desperate explanations that unraveled the moment the video played. Voices clear and unedited. Intent undeniable. Ava handed over the phone without ceremony. She gave her name, her authorization, her account. No embellishment, no fear, just facts. The posture of the MPs shifted as they listened. That small, irreversible change when authority recognizes reality. Restraints clicked. Excuses died mid-sentence. Ava stepped back and let the system do what it was supposed to do, now that it had no place left to hide. Someone tried to smooth it over later. They always do. He spoke softly, about careers, about optics, about not blowing things up. Ava listened until he finished, then told him something he hadn't expected to hear. This wasn't about embarrassment. It was about permission. about what had been allowed to grow because it was easier not to confront it. She didn't threaten. She didn't raise her voice. She simply made it clear that every ignored report, every dismissed concern, every broken light and blind camera would now be examined under daylight. Silence protects predators. Documentation protects everyone else. By morning, the base looked the same. Same concrete, same dust, same formations, but something had shifted beneath it. People stood straighter not because they were afraid, but because the ground felt more solid. Ava walked through without ceremony. No victory, no speech. Just a quiet certainty that dignity, once defended properly, has a way of changing a place. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't announce itself at all. Sometimes it simply stands its ground and lets the truth speak for itself. Why did she feel their resentment before she ever heard it? Because contempt has a temperature. Ava Sloan could feel it rising in the air at Range Annex 9 the same way she could feel a pressure change before a storm. It wasn't loud. It wasn't reckless. It was controlled, deliberate, shared. The kind that grows when people convince each other that disrespect is justified. By the end of the first full training cycle, she understood something clearly. This wasn't about her performance. It was about what she represented, a standard that didn't bend, a presence that didn't seek approval, and that, to men already insecure in their place, felt like an accusation. The mornings began before sunrise, dust still cool, boots crunching softly as trainees formed up, half awake, muscles sore, tempers short. Ava stood off to the side, clipboard tucked under her arm, observing the way small groups clustered, who spoke, who listened, who laughed when they thought she wasn't close enough to hear. Leadership always showed itself in micro moments. The way one man checked another's gear. The way a joke landed and spread. The way silence followed her corrections, not thoughtful silence, but resentful restraint. She marked it all down. Patterns mattered more than incidents. On the surface, they trained hard. They ran the drills. They passed most metrics. But discipline is more than compliance, and Ava could see where it cracked. Sloppy safety habits. Eye contact avoided when corrected. An eagerness to impress each other instead of mastering the task. The kind of shortcuts that didn't look dangerous until suddenly they were. She corrected every one of them the same way. Calm, immediate, unapologetic. It wasn't punishment. It was prevention. Still, every correction landed heavier than the last. Not because she was wrong, but because she wouldn't soften it to spare their pride. One afternoon, during a heat-soaked close-quarters run, a trainee rushed a corner too fast. His muzzle crossed his partner's shoulder by inches. Ava's voice cut through the noise instantly. Freeze. The room locked. The mistake hung there undeniable. The trainee tried to explain it away, already glancing toward his peers for support. Ava didn't argue. She didn't lecture. She marked the failure and ordered him off the line. The look he gave her wasn't embarrassment. It was fury. The kind that says, "You've taken something from me." No, she'd protected everyone else. He just couldn't see the difference. Later, one of the senior cadre approached her quietly. Not hostile, not supportive either. Careful was the word he used. Careful not to lose the room. Ava kept her eyes on her notes when she replied, "I'm not here to win the room. I'm here to keep them alive." The conversation ended there, but the message lingered. Make it easier for them. Let some things slide. Ava had heard that logic before. She'd seen where it led. Coffins don't care about intentions. That night, alone in her barracks room, Ava sat on the edge of the cot longer than usual. The fan rattled overhead. Her muscles ached, not from training but from restraint. It would have been easier to confront them directly, to call out the behavior, to force the issue. But that kind of confrontation often turned into theater. Noise without change. She didn't need noise. She needed truth. And truth, she knew, had a way of surfacing on its own when people believed they were unobserved. So she waited. She trained alone after dark, as she always had. Not to be seen, though she knew she was, but because discipline doesn't turn off when the day ends. She felt their eyes on her again, lingering longer now. Not admiration, assessment. The kind that strips a person down to what they think they can take. Ava didn't alter her routine. Any change would have signaled awareness. Awareness would have shifted their plans. If they were going to cross a line, she needed them to believe it was still invisible. The next days tightened like a wire. Small comments grew bolder. Laughter came quicker. Respect, once superficial, thinned into mockery the moment her back was turned. Still, no one challenged her openly. They didn't want a fight they might lose. They wanted something quieter, something deniable. Ava sensed it and felt the familiar pull of anxiety, not fear but anticipation. The weight of knowing something was coming and choosing not to stop it too early. That choice sat heavy in her chest at night. She reminded herself why she was doing this. One incident documented was a problem. A pattern exposed was a reckoning. On the fifth evening, after a particularly brutal evaluation that ended with multiple failures, Ava noticed the way a group lingered near the barracks longer than necessary. Voices low, movements rehearsed. She logged it mentally and went about her routine. Shower, change, equipment check. She didn't rush. Rushing would have been a tell. When she stepped back into her room, the quiet felt loaded, too still. She closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, listening. Boots just beyond the threshold. Her pulse slowed instead of racing. Training took over where emotion might have surged. She positioned herself where she had space to move. She thought briefly of the younger women on base, the ones watching, learning what silence bought and what it cost. That thought hardened her resolve. Whatever happened next couldn't be messy. It had to be clear. The knock came, hard and mocking. Ava didn't answer. The door opened anyway. And in that moment, before anything physical happened, before words could be twisted, Ava understood exactly why she'd waited. Because what stood in front of her wasn't confusion or miscommunication. It was intent, coordinated, confident, certain they'd get away with it. They had no idea they were stepping into the moment that would end their illusion. And Ava Sloan, standing calm in the center of the room, knew something else too. This wasn't just about her anymore. Why didn't she raise her voice when the door finally opened? Because fear would have given them permission. Ava Sloan stood where she was, feet planted shoulder-width apart, eyes steady, breath slow. The room felt smaller the moment they stepped inside, filled not just with bodies but with assumption that she would freeze, that she would shrink, that the story would bend the way they needed it to. One of them laughed under his breath, the sound sharp and rehearsed. Another lifted a phone, its screen glowing like a witness they thought they controlled. Ava took all of it in without flinching. This wasn't chaos. It was a test. And tests, she knew, only mattered if you stayed clear-headed. She spoke once, leave. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. They ignored it. That told her everything. The first hand reached for her with casual entitlement, not force yet, just familiarity, the kind meant to establish dominance without explanation. Ava moved then, not explosively, efficiently. A shift of weight, a turn of the wrist, a joint taken past the point of cooperation and into inevitability. The confidence on his face collapsed into confusion before pain ever arrived. Ava didn't enjoy it. She didn't linger on it. She used it. Momentum redirected. Balance removed. Control established. He went down on one knee, breath knocked from him, surprise written across his features like betrayal. The others reacted late. That was the second mistake. One surged forward, anger overtaking calculation. Ava felt him more than saw him, caught the movement at the edge of her vision. She pivoted, drove a knee into muscle, not bone, enough to stop forward motion without escalating beyond necessity. He folded with a sound halfway between shock and disbelief. Ava guided him into the wall, pinned his arm, kept her weight centered, still calm, still breathing evenly. The phone kept recording, the red light blinking steadily. Good. Let it see everything. The third hesitated. Hesitation is where outcomes change. He backed up, hands half raised, words spilling too fast to form a defense. Ava stepped toward him and took the phone without yanking it away, without panic. She adjusted the angle deliberately so it captured the room, the forced entry, the restrained men, the blocked exit. Evidence doesn't need drama. It needs clarity. She set the phone down where it could see and hear everything. Then she turned to the last one, still standing in the doorway, still trying to decide if size alone would save him. "Step back," she said. He didn't. Ava dropped her center of gravity and moved inside his balance. The motion was simple, almost inelegant. A hook, a shift, gravity doing the rest. He hit the floor hard, breath leaving him in a rush, more stunned than injured. Ava didn't strike again. She didn't need to. She stood over them, space reclaimed, posture unmistakable. Control wasn't about dominance. It was about containment. On the ground, she ordered, hands visible. This time they listened. The room went quiet except for ragged breathing and the hum of the fan overhead. Ava secured restraints with practiced speed, not rushing, not trembling. Every movement was deliberate. She checked circulation. She ensured no unnecessary injury. She wasn't there to punish. She was there to end the threat. When she leaned down to speak, her voice was low and even. "You didn't walk into a mistake," she said. "You walked into consequences." Someone outside was shouting now. A call had been made. Ava stepped back, giving the camera a clear view of the restrained men and the doorway they'd forced open. She didn't touch anything else. Evidence is fragile when people start improvising. She waited, hands visible, posture neutral. When the first security lights swept across the gravel outside, she felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest, not relief, not fear, but the quiet exhaustion that comes when you know the real work is just beginning. The response was loud, messy, emotional. Accusations flew the moment uniforms appeared. Voices overlapped. Stories tried to take shape before facts could solidify. Ava didn't interrupt, she didn't correct. She simply handed over the phone when asked and stated her name, her role, her authorization. The video spoke for her, clear audio, continuous footage, no gaps, no edits. The tone in the air shifted as it played. Authority recognized reality. That recognition was subtle but irreversible. As the restrained men were separated and escorted away, Ava sat down on the edge of the concrete step outside her room. Her hands finally shook, not from fear, but from adrenaline draining out of her system. She pressed them together until the tremor passed. This part always came later. The quiet moment when your body reminds you that control has a cost. She let it pass without judgment. A senior figure arrived not long after, posture relaxed, expression carefully neutral. He spoke in the language of mitigation, of context, of minimizing damage. Ava listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on the perimeter lights blinking steadily in the distance. When he finished, she stood. "This wasn't spontaneous," she said. "It wasn't confusion, it was planned." He hesitated, then tried again. About careers, about reputation, about keeping things internal. Ava's patience thinned, but her voice didn't change. "Internal silence is why this escalated," she replied. "And it ends tonight." Others began a step forward then. Quiet at first. A trainee, another, phones produced, messages shown, things saved just in case because reporting never felt safe enough before. Ava watched them with something like pride and something like sorrow. This was the cost of delayed accountability, courage deferred until damage forced the issue. By morning, the command space was filled with paperwork and fatigue. Faces drawn, voices low. Ava stood through it all, not defensive, not triumphant, just present. She laid out timelines, patterns, documentation. This wasn't a single event. It was a system finally exposed. The room absorbed it slowly, like a wound being cleaned down to bone. When it was over, Ava walked back onto the range as the sun lifted over the desert. The trainees were forming up again, quieter now, watching. She passed through without comment, without acknowledgement. She didn't need their approval. What mattered was what would come next, the standard reset, the silence broken, the understanding that dignity doesn't require permission to exist. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fatigue and the aftermath, Ava allowed herself one quiet certainty. She had done exactly what she came here to do. Why did the base feel different the next morning, even before anyone said a word? Because silence had shifted sides. Ava Sloan noticed it as she walked across the concrete pad toward the command tent. Boots still moved. Orders were still given. But the casual noise was gone, the loose laughter, the sideways glances that used to follow her like a shadow. What replaced it wasn't fear. It was awareness. The kind that settles in when people realize something they assumed would stay hidden has been dragged into daylight and cannot be put back. Inside the tent, the air was thick with exhaustion. Not the clean fatigue of training, but the heavy kind that comes from staying awake all night trying to manage consequences. Coffee sat untouched. Folders were stacked in uneven piles. A video looped silently on a tablet in the corner, paused at a frame no one wanted to look at for too long. Ava stood where she was directed, hands behind her back, posture neutral. She didn't argue. She didn't perform outrage. She simply answered questions when asked, precisely and without embellishment. They wanted a version that could be wrapped up neatly. She didn't give them one. Every answer came back to process, to timelines, to documentation that had existed before the incident and been ignored, broken lights, unfiled maintenance requests, informal warnings brushed aside as culture. Ava laid it out calmly, not accusing, just factual, the kind of truth that's harder to fight because it doesn't raise its voice. She could see the shift happening in real time, shoulders tightening, pens pausing mid-note. This wasn't just a late-night incident anymore. It was a mirror. At one point, someone asked her if she'd felt threatened before that night. Ava paused before answering. Yes, she said finally, but threat isn't always loud. Sometimes it's repetition. Sometimes it's being told over and over that you should expect less respect and call it resilience. No one interrupted her after that. When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic resolution, just directives issued quietly, temporary removals, reviews initiated, legal processes set in motion. It wasn't justice yet. It was momentum. Ava stepped out into the light feeling the familiar mix of relief and heaviness. Accountability never feels clean in the moment. It always leaves something raw behind. On the training pad, the formation reassembled. A different instructor took the lead. Ava stood off to the side, observing the way eyes tracked her now, not lingering, not dismissive, just careful. She caught the gaze of one of the younger women near the back. The woman held it for a second, then nodded once. It was small. It mattered more than applause ever could. Later, alone again, Ava finally allowed herself to sit. She replayed the night in fragments, not the physical movements but the decisions. The moment she chose not to de-escalate quietly, the choice to let evidence speak instead of reputation. Those decisions carried weight. She knew there would be backlash, whispered criticism, the suggestion that she'd made things harder than necessary. That was always the price of refusing to absorb damage silently. She thought about all the times she had done exactly that earlier in her career, the jokes she'd ignored, the comments she'd filed away instead of reporting, the calculus she'd learned young, survive first, change things later. There was no shame in that. Survival teaches its own wisdom. But standing here now, older, steadier, with less to prove and more to protect, she understood something clearly. Later had finally arrived. That afternoon, statements continued. One by one, people came forward with pieces they'd never thought would matter, a message saved, a remark overheard, a moment that had felt wrong but too small to challenge alone. Together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Ava listened when asked, spoke when necessary, and stayed silent when it wasn't her place. This wasn't about her narrative. It was about letting others reclaim theirs. As the sun dipped lower, the range settled into a subdued rhythm. Training resumed. Evaluations continued. Life moved on as it always does. But underneath it, something fundamental had shifted. Boundaries were no longer theoretical. They were documented, enforced, real. That evening, Ava returned to the gym cage for the first time since the incident. The lights were fully repaired now, bright, unforgiving. She trained the same way she always had, movement steady, breath controlled. A few people passed by. No one lingered. No one watched too long. She finished, wiped her hands, and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle. Strength, she knew, isn't proven in confrontation alone. It's proven in what you refuse to normalize. As she walked back toward the barracks, Ava felt something unfamiliar, not pride exactly, but alignment. The sense that her actions and her values were finally in the same place at the same time. That doesn't happen often in a career built on compromise. When it does, you hold on to it. The base lights flickered on one by one as night returned. Somewhere inside the system, investigations would continue. Outcomes would be decided. Some would call it excessive. Others would call it overdue. Ava didn't need to label it. She had done what she could when it mattered without looking away. And sometimes, that's all integrity asks of you. Why did the hardest part begin, after everything was already over? Because aftermath is where certainty dissolves. Ava Sloan felt it in the days that followed, not as noise but as drag. The kind that slows every step, every decision, every breath. The investigation moved with institutional gravity, deliberate and unmoved by emotion. Interviews, timelines, requests for clarification that asked the same question 3 different ways, as if repetition might produce a crack. Ava answered each one with the same calm precision she'd used on the range. Facts didn't change just because people were uncomfortable with them. Still, the quiet came with its own weight. She wasn't teaching now. She'd been reassigned temporarily, pending review, the phrase soft enough to sound neutral and sharp enough to sting. It wasn't punishment, not officially, but it felt like suspension in midair, neither vindicated nor accused, just waiting. Ava filled the time the only way she knew how. Morning runs before dawn, maintenance checks on equipment that didn't need them. Long hours alone, reviewing her own notes as if she were someone else's case study. Doubt crept in during those hours. Not about what had happened, that remained clear, but about consequence. Had she pushed too far? Had she made it harder for the people who came after her? She thought of the young trainees still moving through the program, of the women watching quietly from the edges. Change often came with backlash, and backlash had a way of landing hardest on the ones with the least protection. Ava sat with that fear without trying to outrun it. Fear, she'd learned, only grows when ignored. One evening, a knock came at her door, softer than the one that had changed everything. It was one of the trainees, the young woman who'd nodded to her on the pad days earlier. She stood stiffly, unsure whether she was even allowed to be there. Ava waved her in without ceremony. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching until the trainee finally spoke. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She said, "I didn't think anyone would listen." Her voice wavered once, then steadied. Ava nodded. "They listened because you spoke," she replied. "It wasn't deflection, it was truth." Courage multiplies when it's shared. After the trainee left, Ava sat alone longer than she meant to. She thought about how close she'd come, years ago, to becoming someone who stayed silent out of habit. How easy it would have been to write off the harassment as distraction, the incident as isolated, the consequences as not her responsibility. The system encourages that kind of thinking. It rewards endurance over intervention. Ava had played that game before. She understood why people kept their heads down, but understanding didn't mean agreeing anymore. Word traveled, even without official statements. Some messages came quietly, support wrapped in discretion. Others carried sharp edges, anonymous and bitter, accusing her of overreaction, of damaging cohesion, of making herself the story. Ava read them once and deleted them. She didn't need to internalize someone else's discomfort. She learned long ago that cohesion built on silence wasn't cohesion at all. It was compliance waiting to fracture. Weeks passed. The range kept running. New faces rotated in. Old ones disappeared. Ava remained in that strange in-between space, her future unresolved. There were moments when she missed the simplicity of direct missions, clear objectives, defined threats, immediate outcomes. This was different, slower, more ambiguous. The kind of mission where success wasn't measured in results you could see right away. One morning, she was called back to the command building. The room looked smaller than she remembered, fewer people, less posturing. A stack of finalized reports sat in the center of the table. Ava stood as they summarized findings she already knew, charges moving forward, oversight failures acknowledged, policy changes recommended. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't celebration. It was confirmation, the kind that settles into your bones quietly without ceremony. When they asked if she had anything to add, Ava considered it carefully. "I want this to last," she said. "Not just until attention fades. Systems don't change because of one incident. They change because someone keeps watching after everyone else moves on." There was a pause, then a nod. No promises were made, but something shifted, not dramatically, not publicly, just enough to matter. When Ava walked out of the building, the sun was high, the range alive with familiar sounds. She paused, letting the noise wash over her. For the first time since that night, she felt something unclench inside her chest. Not relief exactly. Acceptance. The understanding that some outcomes were already beyond her control, and that was okay. That afternoon, she returned to the gym cage again. Training had always been her anchor, the place where her body reminded her what her mind already knew. She moved through the routine slower now, more reflective. Each repetition grounded her. Strength wasn't just about force. It was about continuity, about showing up again and again, even when the spotlight had moved on. As she finished, a few trainees passed by. One hesitated, then spoke. "Chief," he said quietly, no sarcasm, no bravado, just acknowledgement. Ava nodded back and kept walking. Respect, she knew, didn't always come with agreement. Sometimes it came with recognition, and that was enough. That night, alone in her room, Ava finally slept without replaying the door opening, the voices, the moment everything pivoted. Sleep came heavy and deep, the kind earned only after carrying something too long. When she woke before dawn, she felt lighter, not because the past was erased, but because it no longer owned her. She dressed, laced her boots, and stepped outside as the first light touched the horizon. The base stretched out before her, imperfect and ongoing. Ava took a breath and started running, the rhythm steady, her pace unhurried. Whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she always had. Clear-eyed, grounded, unwilling to look away. Why did she hesitate before stepping onto the transport that would take her away? Because endings are rarely clean, and this one carried more than relief. Ava Sloane stood on the edge of the tarmac just after dawn, duffel at her feet, the air cool enough to bite. The base was waking up behind her in familiar sounds, engines turning over, boots striking pavement, radios crackling with routine. It looked the same as the morning she arrived. That was the strange part. Places rarely show the scars of what they survive. They just keep functioning as if nothing ever happened. Ava knew better. She learned that systems absorb shock quietly, the way bodies do, healing unevenly, remembering long after the surface looks normal. Her orders had come through the night before. Temporary assignment concluded. Another instructor rotated in. The language was neutral, efficient. It always was. No mention of what she'd forced into the open. No acknowledgement of the weight she'd carried so others wouldn't have to. Ava didn't expect one. Institutions don't thank people for disrupting their comfort. They move forward and hope memory fades. She lifted the duffel and walked slowly, letting each step register. She wasn't leaving defeated. She wasn't leaving victorious either. She was leaving changed, and aware that change rarely announces itself in real time. As she passed the training pad one last time, a formation stood assembled. Different faces now, different posture. The cadence of instruction was sharper, less performative. Ava stopped just beyond the perimeter, out of sight, and watched for a moment. She noticed small things, corrections given and accepted without protest. A joke cut short when it crossed a line. A trainee stepping in when another faltered, not to mock but to stabilize. None of it dramatic, all of it meaningful. This was how progress looked when it wasn't chasing applause. Someone approached her quietly from behind. The new lead instructor, younger, careful in his bearing. He didn't thank her. He didn't apologize for what she'd endured. He simply said, "The standard's holding." Ava nodded once. That was enough. Standards don't need praise, they need guardians. The transport crew signaled they were ready. Ava took one last look around, committing the place to memory not as it had been when she arrived, but as it was now, unsettled, recalibrating, aware. She climbed aboard and took a seat by the window. As the vehicle rolled forward, the base receded into the distance, its outlines softening under the rising sun. Only then did the exhaustion finally catch up with her. Not the physical kind, the deeper fatigue that comes from sustained vigilance, from being alert not just to threats but to meaning. Ava closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engine steady her thoughts. Images surfaced uninvited: early years in uniform, mentors who taught her when to speak and when to stay quiet, moments she'd chosen endurance over confrontation because the cost felt too high at the time. She didn't judge those choices now. They had kept her alive. They had carried her to this point. But she understood something she hadn't before. Survival is not the same as dignity. Dignity requires action, sometimes quiet, sometimes costly, always intentional. The transport landed hours later at a different base, a different horizon. Ava stepped out, slung her duffel over her shoulder, and blended into the flow of people who didn't know her story. She liked it that way. Identity built on recognition was fragile. Identity built on principle lasted longer. Over the following weeks, she settled back into instruction elsewhere. New students, new challenges. The work was the same, but she found herself speaking up sooner when lines blurred, intervening earlier when culture drifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. She watched others notice. Some resisted, some adjusted. A few thanked her later privately when no one else was around. One evening she received a message forwarded through official channels, a brief update, policy revisions finalized, reporting pathways clarified, lighting upgrades standardized, oversight requirements formalized. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't personal, but Ava read it twice anyway. Change rarely arrives as closure, it arrives as infrastructure. She saved the message, then closed it without replying. That night she trained alone again as she always did. Different gym, same rhythm, each movement deliberate, unhurried. Sweat stung her eyes, muscles burned, breath evened out. In motion she felt whole, not hardened, aligned, the body remembering its purpose, the mind no longer braced for impact. As she cooled down, Ava thought of the women and men she'd left behind, of the ones who'd spoken when it finally felt possible, of the ones who hadn't yet but now knew they might be heard. She knew the work wasn't finished. It never was, but it was underway, and that mattered. Later, alone in her quarters, Ava wrote a single line in her notebook before turning out the light. Not a report, not a reminder, just a truth she didn't want to forget. Silence is a choice, so is integrity. She slept deeply, without dreams. When morning came, Ava rose before the alarm, dressed, and stepped into another ordinary day. No cameras, no audience, just the quiet, ongoing responsibility of living by the standard she believed in. She didn't expect recognition. She didn't need it. Some victories don't announce themselves. They settle into the background and change the shape of what comes next. And somewhere, long after the details faded and the names were forgotten, the impact remained. In the way someone spoke up sooner, stepped back when corrected, or chose not to cross a line because they knew it was real. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. Sometimes it doesn't even stay. Sometimes it simply acts and leaves the world a little harder to abuse than it was before.